My name is Sandra Struggles. I'm a local historian. I'd like to tell you about the report about the Markham pit disaster. The men on the night shift at Markham number 1 pit went to work as usual on Monday the 9th of May, not knowing that by the end of that ill-fated shift, more than 2/3 of them would be dead or seriously injured. At 5:30 the next morning, the shift was coming to an end. Most of the 160 men in the pit were preparing to leave, and some had already started to make their way to the pit bottom. This was the black shale seam, the deepest at 700 yards below ground, and the farthest away from the pit bottom, some 1.5 miles. In the pit yard, men on the day shift were arriving, ready to start work at 6 o'clock. Suddenly, a tremendous draft got up, followed by a terrific bang. Black coal dust and smoke filled the pit. There had been an explosion of gas at the coal face. The men on their way to the pit bottom were blown off their feet and had to crawl through thick black dust, choking and using the tub rails to guide them. Many collapsed from the gas fumes. The report said there was a terrible draft that threw men around like shuttlecocks. Mr. Scott, an electrician in the pit, was about a mile away from the pit bottom. He said there were terrible bullets of wind. It was impossible to see a thing, for huge clouds of coal dust filled the air. With the aid of his lamp, he managed to get to the pit bottom, and he switched off the main electricity supply. If the explosion had happened half an hour later, the 250 men on the day shift would have also been involved. Men underground at Island Colliery felt the blast. My dad was one of them. He was 14 years old. He said it shook the whole ground, and the coal dust stung our eyes and made us choke. Within half an hour after the blast, a team of rescue workers were ready to go underground to start the rescue operation. They were some of the men who had turned up for the day shift. Wearing respirators and oxygen tanks, they took with them fire extinguishers and canaries in cages to detect the gas. William Hill of 4 Edward Street, Staveley, was one of the first to volunteer. He stumbled across a body and found it was that of his brother Clarence. Speaking later, he told how his brother Clarence had nearly missed the shift that night because his baby was poorly with the whooping cough. But in the end, he decided to go to work because they needed the money. All the men at the coal face were dead. The report said all the dead would have been killed instantly from carbon monoxide poisoning. They would have been dead before being burnt or hurled about. One rescue worker said that some of the men were so badly mutilated and burned he thought it would be impossible to identify them. An explosion took place in almost the same spot on the 21st of January 1937, when 9 men were killed. The news of the blast soon spread around, and within minutes of hearing the dreadful news, relatives were up and dressed and rushing to the pit. At the Granger house in Clown, Mrs. Elizabeth Granger was getting the breakfast ready for her husband John and son Robert, both on the night shift, when her younger son told her there was something wrong at the pit. She just left everything and caught the bus to the pit to find out what had happened. At the pit head, relatives were gathering, and were told about the explosion. They just stood there, gripped with fear and dread, praying that their husband, son, brother would come out of the pit alive. By 10:30, 41 men had been taken to Chesterfield Royal Hospital. Some were very badly burned and injured. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly apparent that fewer men were going to the hospital and more were being taken to the mortuary. Nearby garages, sheds, any buildings that could be used were made into temporary mortuaries. All day long, the families waited as one by one the dead men were brought out of the pit. There, the burned and mutilated bodies of the men were laid, covered with blankets and each wearing a label. Below ground, the rescue party continued their search, battling with debris, fire, and the smell of gas which filled the pit. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the first official statement came from the Staveley Company. It said, "The cause of the accident is at present unknown. 41 men have been taken to hospital, 27 bodies recovered deceased, and there are still 51 missing." All that day it went on until about 6:30 in the evening, when a further statement was made and the worst fears confirmed. The whole of the pit has been examined and all the men accounted for. There was no one still in the pit alive. Total death roll is now 72. The remaining bodies will be got out as soon as possible. Then followed the names and addresses of 14 men, up until now the only ones that could be identified. The relatives, stricken with grief, stood there all night. They watched in agony as one by one the dead men were brought out. They were told to go home and get some rest, but they still stayed there hoping and praying. At 3 a.m. on Wednesday, when the last man had been recovered, it was officially stated that the death toll was 78. On Wednesday morning, relatives came back to the pit. They sat in rows on forms in the pit yard and were taken in turn into the buildings where the bodies were laid out. Some of the men were so badly burned they could only be identified by their personal belongings, their belts or their shoes. Most of the men were married with young families. Some men had served in the First World War. Several coffins were covered with the Union Jack. After the identity ordeal was over, the relatives were led to another building where details of the men were taken by the police. Those who survived were the ones nearest to the pit bottom, escaping the full force of the blast. Crowds of people stood outside the railings of Chesterfield Royal Hospital, waiting for news. On Saturday the 14th of May, all 79 men were buried throughout the day in 13 cemeteries. Funeral arrangements had been made without delay. The expenses were to be paid by the Staveley Company. It was suggested to have all 79 men buried together, but relatives wanted the men buried in their own villages. On the 10th of May 2013, a red rose was placed on every grave of the 79 dead men in 13 cemeteries. This was organised by Graham Challenge, and the children from the nearest school to each cemetery laid the roses at 11 a.m.